G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope that you are super well. Today I'm here to talk about the release of the flagship Sony A1 II. It was 1 a.m. here and I was texting with my good friend Seth Miranda, who was live at the event in New York. Now, this is a super exciting release. Anytime a camera company releases a flagship camera, we're all excited. And of course for Sony, when it comes to their full frame 35mm Alpha cameras, this is only their second flagship camera. It's been 11 years since Sony shipped their very first mirrorless 35mm full frame cameras, the A7 and the A7R, 2013. It took until the end of 2020, the start of 2021 for their first flagship to arrive. What I'm interested in talking about in this video is why has Sony made the specific decisions they have with the upgrades between the Mark I and Mark II A1s, and what is the impact on the industry? How does this fit in with their major competitors, Canon and Nikon, and their relative products in the market? Now, depending on which way you cut this, which way you look at it, and there's no right or wrong here, and this is all my opinion, and of course everyone else is entitled to their own opinion, but it's possible that we consider the closest competitors to the A1 II being the R5 II and the Z8, which then makes Sony's pricing very interesting. So I want to talk about all of that and more in this video. Please join me. Probably the biggest and most obvious change is the exterior and ergonomic changes. What we're told is that the A1 II is now in exactly the same body as the A9 III, and you can hear it in their own launch video. This is the ergonomics that we finally wanted to see in a Sony flagship camera. Even Sony recognized that the ergonomics were perhaps a little tight for some in the past, and now this is the sort of camera that you can hold on to. And ultimately, what does that mean? Well, the camera is larger in the hand, and well, people like me with large hands, that's just so exciting. As we can see here, and I have owned Sony Alpha cameras since they launched in 2013, purchasing the first A7R, which I still own, along here with the A7R III. But my largest complaint, and it was a deal breaker complaint, is just simply the ergonomics. And the notion, which I have not tested myself, that the flagship camera now has flagship level ergonomics. That is absolutely awesome. I think they call it the 4-way vari-angle screen or something like that. From my perspective, and I think almost everyone else, this is the best in class rear screen for any camera and any user. And I agree with that. I think the one that comes next close to it is the one that you find in the Z8 and Z9, which has some of its own tricks, which are pretty cool, but it isn't forward facing. And that's where this Sony screen that's now across a number of their cameras, I think at least 3, correct me if I'm wrong if there's more than 3, that's the A7R5, the A9, and of course this new camera. Are there more? Please let me know. This screen is best in class and we would all agree with that. The next big upgrade, which seems to be having an impact, I'm not sure, or it might well be that the electronic stabilization is having more of an impact if you look at videos, say, from Gerald Undone, is that Sony are quoting that they have an improved in-body image stabilization system up to 8.5 stops in the middle, which is very specific there. Coming along with the A9 III body and ergonomics, finally on a flagship from Sony, we have a function button on the front of the camera. It is only one, and for example, the Z9 has 3, but at least there's 1 there now. And from my perspective, it might be a bit tough to get 3 on the front because, of course, Sony's lens release button is in the same area of the camera, whereas Nikon's lens release button is actually physically on the other side of the camera. You just basically never accidentally press it. And that might be part of the concern that when bodies were smaller and you have buttons down there and you have a lens release button, people might accidentally press the wrong button and then suddenly your lens might be released. The advent of the larger body in the A9 III and the A1 II has allowed for a front-facing function button, which is mostly being touted to be able to be the burst button for high-speed bursts. But of course, Like with Sony's, you can kind of program any button to do anything. And one other major advancement in the A1 II, of course, is the AI chip, which is continuing to improve focus in both stills and video. On the inside, probably one of the things that's most exciting for Sony users is pre-capture, pre-release capture. That's the ability to go back in time with your half press to a full press and grab action that happened 1 second ago because that's being thrown into your buffer and held onto. And another fine-grained part of that is the fact that you can dial up how far back in time you want to go. Is it like 0.3, 0.5 of a second or a full second? And this is in RAW. The difference between, say, Nikon, which is currently only doing it in JPEG across all their cameras, and RAW in the Sony A1. Big deal, very exciting. I know, yes, Bruce, I'm thinking of you. I know lots of people that are super excited about that. And there's been a whole massive range of just little updates that we've seen Sony put into all of their lower cameras in the intervening time between A1 Mark I and A1 Mark II. Lots of little stuff, which I won't go into, that's now in this camera. Some of it has arrived in the A1 via firmware, but some of it has not. And that's where we're seeing, if you look at videos that have been published, there is a lot going in the comments about this release. This is where I want to get to what is the impact of this camera for Sony and what is the impact on the market and its competitors. And we'll start with Sony. For people who've bought the A1, and this opinion is not my own, it's shared by others, it's not a clear pathway upgrading from the A1 to the A1 II. There just might not be enough advancements in it to make it worthwhile. And this is critical when you're talking about a flagship because they are very expensive. Some of the things that seem to not have changed at all includes the sensor, which we're told is the same sensor. And I had heard some rumblings that there might have been some differences in dynamic range, but Gerald Undone has put out a video saying that is not the case. They are the same. There's been really no advancements when it comes to video, which is really interesting to me when we look at, for example, Nikon's offerings with the Z8 and the Z9, which are absolute video powerhouses. And you can kind of only think that that's happening because of Sony's big investment and huge range of cinema cameras from entry level all the way up to Hollywood level. Otherwise, why not make this flagship camera, when it comes to video, more commensurate with the market? And this is where the problems start to occur for me. You've got a flagship price, and you've now got other flagships in the market. And if you're going to pay that big money, you need that camera to be an all-rounder. You need it to be able to do anything and everything that you want to throw at it. And it's not that it can't do video. And sure, we don't all shoot RAW and those higher end codecs all the time. It's absolutely true. But this is Sony. They have the technology, and what has been sold to us over the last decade of Sony's dominance in this space is that they are the technology leaders. Yet here we have a move that contradicts that. So regardless of who uses it and who doesn't, this is not technological leadership in this flagship camera when it comes to video. What is Sony doing here? And it's hard to understand. I don't own an A1. I won't be buying an A1 II because I can't afford it. In this country, an A1 II, and this is without a vertical grip, it's $11,000. Add a grip, which I think I saw for $749, and you are really not getting much change from $12,000. Okay, so Sony have told us they're the technology leaders, but this camera is not leading when it comes to video. Okay, they're telling us they're the speed leaders. Okay, well, they've decided to sit at 30 frames per second with the same sensor. Okay, that's fine. For, I would say, 99+% of use cases, 30 frames is enough. But leadership. No, this is not taking the lead. They're sitting at a point here. Now, this probably is a good moment for me to dovetail over to the fact that I made a video about 6 months ago saying when it comes to technology, we're probably starting to hit some of the ceilings. There's always more that you can squeeze out of these systems, but it becomes a cost-benefit analysis. Can we give you more dynamic range? Can we give you more speed? Can we give you faster readout? Probably, but how much is it going to cost? We can certainly say that is the case when we look at the Red Raptor. Here we have the only sensor of its type on the market, an 8K global 17 plus stops of dynamic range sensor. Now, how is it that they have one and they can do it, but Sony and Canon don't? And it's simply, I would say, cost. These sensors are extraordinarily expensive to make. And so the technology exists, but in this space where here in this country, we don't really want to spend more than around 10,000. Like for me, once we get to that 10,000 mark, it's like, I'm just simply never going to buy that camera. It's just too much. It's just too much. Even for a working professional, it is an enormous amount of money. Camera manufacturers have to say to themselves, how many people are just not going to be able to spend this money? How many units are we actually going to sell? And what is our ROI, our return on investment? The camera spec wars, there's not the major brushstrokes. There's not the major advancements that we saw over the previous decade. And what's interesting to me about that previous decade, of course, is we did have the narrative that Sony were the innovator, the leader, and so on. I just think it's important for everybody not to forget that they also had a 5-year lead on Canon and Nikon. It's essentially like, let's run a marathon. Right now, let's say the marathon's finished and it's an 11-year marathon, and they started 5 years early, the marathon, which means they had half completed the marathon almost when the other two companies got into it. And guess what? The other two companies, depending on what you think about Canon's offerings, but certainly Nikon's offerings, they have managed to catch up that half marathon lead and, well, really, in some respects, actually overtaken Sony. That lead that Sony had, they certainly had it when the A1 came out. It was the best flagship we'd ever seen in the 35 mirrorless space. But guess what? It was also the only flagship we had seen in the 35 mirrorless space. Canon never said the R5 was their flagship. Just months after the Sony A1 started shipping in very, very early 2021, we saw the development announcement of the Z9. I think it was something like March or April of 2021. And then, of course, the camera shipped later that year. Sony's lead at the top and their lead as innovators at the top was actually very short-lived. And we've had now the Z9 in the market for almost exactly 3 years at this point in time. And that is 3 years that Sony could have done anything to try and clearly be the market leader, the technology leader, and the innovator. Because that's what Sony have told us they are, who they are, and how they've had such leadership and how they've been so far ahead due to their innovation, their technology, their leadership. Well, I would like to conject that some of what looked like their amazing innovative head start was simply they had years. They had years to make themselves look better. And they were absolutely on their own when it came to the 35mm mirrorless space. Because what seems to be being borne out here is when faced with the technological advancement of the Z9 and then the Z8, their response has been fine, but it's certainly not the response of a technological leader. Perhaps the most technological thing we are seeing in the new A1 II is their AI focusing chip. Sony already has that and they've had it for a while, and now Canon has it. And quite frankly, whether it's an actual separate discrete chip or whether it's a couple of cores on a multi-core processor, it's hard to actually know. But either way, it kind of all adds up to the same sort of thing: extra processing power. I don't see that as a major innovation like we've seen in the past from Sony and, let's say, Canon when the R5 very first arrived. These were large steps. The Z9 arrived, that was another huge step. Also, when it comes to Sony users and some of the grievances we've seen in regards to the flagship A1, firmware. Now, I was listening to Gerald Undone in his closing statements on his recent video talking about the fact that, well, not only have we not gotten a lot of firmware that we should have in regards to updates of features that have come in much lesser cameras, But some of those firmware updates have needed to be pulled. Some of those firmware updates have actually bricked certain components of the camera. Now, I can't think of when that last happened to Nikon. It certainly hasn't happened to me with a single one of their cameras that I have owned, and it's almost all of the Z cameras. I don't think that's happened in the Z era at all, bricking a camera or a function of their camera, an essential function of a camera that, yeah, I mean, that sort of stuff just shouldn't happen when it comes to a flagship. This is the camera that professionals rely on. There are real world, absolutely acceptable grievances there when it comes to Sony and their approach to firmware with the A1. And one final complaint there is some of the features that are now in the A1 II, well, couldn't they be in the A1 via firmware? Now, this is something that camera companies do, and Sony are not the only one that does it, but that's essentially applying the cripple hammer so that, yes, you're kind of forced, if you want that particular feature, to upgrade. Sony has kind of been the golden child of mirrorless, innovating, showing us that they're the leader. But really, over the last 3 or so years, I think that title and that mantle has gently but slowly been eroded with all of these little decisions and these maneuvers. And you just can't mess around with flagship cameras. They need to be the best. They need to be absolutely 100% bulletproof and reliable. And they need to work, not just for enthusiasts, but they actually need to work for professionals. They are halo products that largely professionals get in their hands, and then we show what's capable with the product. The only defense I could think for Sony is that the A1 was their first actual flagship 35mm mirrorless camera. Sure, and they haven't really been in this type of market before. I don't think Sony Walkmans or Discmans or compact digital cameras, even cinema cameras, they don't quite fall into this category of everyday level cameras which are used by professionals. There's just a huge expectation on this equipment, and it's very different to just straight consumer equipment like a pocket camera, a handy cam, a Discman or a Walkman. It's just different. Those are kind of recreational items. These are professional tools. Look, that's just food for thought on that front, but it's always been part of my reservation with owning these cameras, as I have, is I was a professional buying it as a professional tool, but I felt like me and my professional needs and who I am was just simply not being taken seriously because, well, I have big hands and this camera is just swallowed by my hand. Now, that's been addressed or is being addressed slowly across the line with their top 2 most expensive cameras having the best ergonomics to date. Absolutely. Fantastic. But my concerns were prior to that, which is now we're just talking a year. So it took them 10 years, 2013 to 2023, to take people like me seriously. That's how long it took them to implement that. And now I kind of feel like we're seeing that thinking again, still existing with the A1 and firmware, and just how that's all been treated. Personally, I have no problem with the update between the A1 and the A1 II simply from a technology perspective. It's very normal for the camera industry to do exactly what we've seen here, where the technology in the camera hasn't changed that much. Like I went from a Nikon D3 to a D3S. The differences between those cameras was absolutely minor. I think it went slightly faster and had half a stop more of dynamic range and really ridiculously minor things which you had to buy a whole new camera to get. There is way more going on between the A1 and the A1 II. Way more than back in that era. Personally, I have no problem with this update. And if you look at the update in isolation, the A1 II in isolation, absolutely superb, outstanding camera. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about how amazing the A1 II is. It's amazing. But I'm talking about what this tells us about Sony and the greater market. Let's say you're a phone user who's decided you want to become a professional photographer or you seriously want to get into photography. You've got, let's say, $10,000 US to spend and you want to get into it properly. And you're going to look at the market for cameras of a sort of similar size and a similar sort of spec. And let's say it's the R5 II, the Z8. What's Sony's closest camera to those two? Well, it's the A1 or the A1 II. They're the closest cameras. And then you've just got to simply look at the price point. For argument's sake, let's say that those cameras are kind of 90 to 95% within each other's capabilities. And the number's probably higher, but I'll just stick with that for the sake of being conservative. The differences in those cameras is not going to affect 90 to 95% of us if there's an advantage with one that the other doesn't have. For example, a Z8 can shoot internal RAW. That's going to be a high number, like doesn't affect 99% of us, and so on. Everybody's got their own little unique advantages and disadvantages. But for that other 90 to 95% that are going, oh, which system should I get into? Then you start looking at the overall ecosystem, lenses, choices, so on. But you are going to look at the initial buy price of the camera. Now, right now, a Z8 in the US is $3,500, whereas the A1 II is $6,500. Epically more expensive, almost twice the price. Now, of course, people might say, well, buy the A1. And absolutely, yes, you could buy that, but that is most definitely a lesser camera. And like simply from an ergonomic perspective, you just want to go with the A1 II if you're comparing it to, say, a Z8. We can decide it doesn't really matter whether it's $5,500 for an A1 or $6,500 for an A1 II. Both of them are significantly more expensive for that 90% of users. And if you want to go with Canon, well, they have their offering that's sitting at around $4,000 for the R5 II. So what does this mean to the market? What I'm getting from reading lots of comments after the A1 II has dropped is there are a lot of frustrated Sony users. Now, how Sony decides to respond to all of this is, well, that's yet to be seen. What will they do with firmware? What will they do with pricing? But ultimately, what this means is there's, a minimum of 2 years and maybe 4 years where this is the flagship. And of course, Nikon, where the Z9 is still ridiculously relevant, is cheaper than this camera, has a vertical grip, all the stuff we know about a Z9. Now, my great friend Bruce reminded me that the flash sync speed of the A1 II is 1/400th of a second, which does make it a whole stop faster than, say, the Z8 and Z9. That's true. But again, it's an extraordinarily rare use case, and it sits up there in that 99% of users don't use it. And in that particular case, there are obviously other ways of doing business. There's not just one way to take photos with flashes with a set shutter speed. So sure, I get it, that's an advantage, but it is a niche advantage. What do you do if you're coming into the market fresh and you see Z8, R5 II and you see A1 and they're all kind of similar form factors, none of them have vertical grips? I think it's tough, and I think that's a tough message to Sony users. I really do, because the advancements between the A1 II and the Z8, I don't think are that profound to go, yes, it's worth $3,000 more or almost twice the price. Look, it's a really interesting conversation. As I said, this is just my opinion on the market and the impacts of this camera and what it means and what it's kind of potentially telling us about these companies. I do think, as I said 6 months ago, that the spec wars, the technological spec wars are really slowing down due to the ceiling in technology and the immense cost of pushing through that ceiling. And so where we're going to see more differences is external ergonomics, monitors, how the monitors flip, EVFs, I/O. These are the sorts of things that we're more likely to see advancements in. And there's been no talk about the CF Express Type A card, whether it is a 4.0 or not. Now, maybe it is, or maybe it isn't. Nobody's talked about it. And I was waiting to hear Gerald Undone talk about it, but he didn't. And he's usually the sort of guy that gets all those sorts of details. I really look forward to seeing how the camera lands in the real world, because there might be parts of this that the spec sheet doesn't kind of tell us. We're kind of hearing that a little bit with the R1. Specs don't tell us everything. Like I said, I'm not overly interested in specs. I'm more interested in what these kind of flagships, which the Z8 is absolutely kind of just a cut down flagship, to be honest. It's so much the Z9, it's not funny. How are these flagships comparing? And they have really different prices. More importantly than what I think is absolutely, what do you think of what's happened here today with the A1 II. How does it impact the R5 II and the Z8? How closely are they spec to each other? It's super interesting stuff. All right, I really look forward to some robust and mature and polite conversation in the comments below. It's been so good to see you. If this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now.